Our scripture reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew in the 14th chapter, verses 13 through 21. Now, when Jesus heard this, that is, about the death of his cousin John the Baptist, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So this story, the feeding of the 5,000 plus women and children, let's not forget them, shall we? Happens just after Jesus receives the news of the death of John the Baptist. Now, do you remember what happened there? I will remind you in case you don't. King Herod had beheaded John the Baptist in this very Shakespearean manner due to the sentiments of his sister-in-law and the birthday wish of her daughter. You remember that? Then John's disciples, it says, came and took away the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. And our text this morning picks up the story here. When he heard what had happened, Jesus withdrew privately by boat to a lonely place. But people heard of it and came after him in crowds by land from the towns. Jesus withdrew privately in grief after John's death to a lonely place. And the story of a miracle begins in that place. We know that place. You hear bad news, and it sends you to a lonely place. You experience the loss of a broken relationship, the death of a friend, the failing of a dream, and you enter a lonely place. You receive the news about a test, condition, that challenges your dependency on and expectation of health and wholeness for your body, and you go to a lonely place. It wasn't long before Jesus, though, was called upon again to minister to the clamoring crowds, no matter how he may have felt in that lonely place. The people still needed him. They were hurting and needed comfort. They were sick and needed healing. They were troubled and needed compassion. They were overwhelmed and needed hope. They were hungry and needed something to eat. And there were 5,000, plus the women and children. Jesus sees them all. But listen, he doesn't ask the men, "Don't you have a job?" He doesn't chastise the women for having too many kids. He didn't ask if they were citizens of Galilee or from some other country. Jesus doesn't see people that way. He just sees the need. And so Jesus goes to them in their lonely places with comfort and healing and compassion and hope. And what does he do? He asks someone else to give them something to eat. And the story goes that when evening came, the disciples approached Jesus and said, "Jesus, this is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said to them, no, they don't need to go away. As if Jesus knew that what was needed at times like that, when the lonely place is full to overflowing, what is needed is something like company and companionship. When times are tough, there's more nourishment found in another's presence than in the rice and beans we can take in. When times are tough, maybe it's not so much what you eat as who you table with in the lonely places. And that's where the miracle really begins. So Jesus tells the disciples they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And at the end of that very long day, exhausted and spent themselves, you can imagine, all the disciples can think of is scarcity. All of the things they don't have. Jesus, we don't have anything here. Just 5 loaves and 2 fish. We have nothing, they said. Well, we know what that's like, don't we? We're overwhelmed and wiped out emotionally, physically, spiritually, financially. All we can think about is how little there is and that it's not enough. So what happens then? Jesus doesn't tell the disciples, yeah, you're right, just send them away. He tells the disciples, bring the fish and bread here to me. Hand it over to Jesus. The paltry pieces and the leftovers and the scraps at the bottom of the barrel. Bring it to me. And the miracle is, they do. Along with a large measure of doubt, I'm sure, that it will make any difference, they hand it over. They must have been thinking, Jesus, are you feeling all right, man? It's been a long day here, but this is barely a snack for us. And there are 5,000 men out there, plus women and children. 5,000 plus. And they looked at their own resources and said, there's not enough. There's just not enough. It's all they can see. A lot of times it's all we can see. Nothing. Now we tend to wonder about the logistics of miracles. We get hung up on exactly how they happened. Maybe you don't, I do. Miracles, we think, require some kind of magic, right? That mere mortals are not given privy to. So we wonder, did Jesus multiply all at once so that the fish and bread for 5,000 plus were spilling out all over the place? And the disciples had to reach out to the people in the front row to help pass it around? Did it magically multiply as the baskets were passed so that as you took some, more instantly appeared like the banquet table in Harry Potter? Maybe you took out the loaf, turned to your child to get them up on your knee, only to turn back and see that there were 2 more loaves in front of you. The gospel writers never tell us how it works, right? What we do know about this miracle is that it all started from a lonely place, from a place of grief and mourning and lack and need for Jesus and for the people who came. They were all present in a large multitude that day. And when it comes to this particular story, I can't help but wonder if the miracle was all about handing over the bits and pieces. Jesus started with what the disciples had, and they freely offered it up. But think with me for a minute about the rest of the people. All the ones that were gathered there. The people trailing down that mountainside must have watched the disciples up at the front. And everyone except for the first couple of rows couldn't really hear what was being said, but could see it unfolding. They watched as the disciples handed over 2 small fish and a few loaves of bread, and they must have muttered and chuckled to themselves, they're crazy up there if they think that's enough. And then they see Jesus lift up the bits and appear to pray to God, and the baskets start going around. Something moved among them that day, something of the spirit of the thing, that the people were touched and moved by the man and his friends who gave all they had and shared it so generously with the multitude of strangers sitting before them. I think that moved the people. So I wonder if the bits didn't multiply in that spirit taking over the crowd. Imagine sitting at the back of that crowd and watching the scene unfold before you and sensing the massive generosity and spirit of grace consuming the people, riding like a tidal wave down the hill. The basket passes by, and you can't help but sense the snack that you'd packed in your own satchel. The one you packed for the trip up the mountain by the lake to hear this man Jesus, because that's likely what they done that morning. I highly doubt they left the house without something to make it through the day. But you know it wasn't enough to share, so you keep it tucked away in a piece of cloth waiting for the chance to walk off by yourself and have a bite. Except that when the basket comes around and you see the bits adding up and people taking just a little, just enough for what they need, wanting to see it work for the efforts and kindness of the men up front, and instead of taking, maybe they leave a little of their own behind. Everyone adding their little bit. It's a miracle when it happens, I think. When people care about someone else and not just themselves. Until the baskets come round again to the disciples, and when the scraps were picked up, there was enough left over to fill 12 whole baskets. Perhaps the miracle wasn't just the multiplication of food, however you think that may have happened. But the idea of handing over what you do have, handing it over to Jesus, that was initiated by the disciples, and how the crowds perhaps followed their faithful example. But I can hear you saying, that's not a miracle. But is it? Jesus tells his followers, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And they did. They handed over what they had. And I think it is a miracle when people give what they have and give it generously without concern for the amount or how far it will go. And listen, they didn't care whether the recipients were worthy of such a generous offering, whether they were rich or poor, or whether they were from this country or somewhere else. They handed it over to God and shared it. So wonder with me today, what is the little bit you have? What resources? What love? What hope? What willingness to stand and fight for justice do you bear? What is the little bit you hope to hand over to God, expecting it to grow and make a difference in God's keeping? Sharing our little bits. What do you think? It's not a miracle. Or is it just? Trusting that out of a lunch pail, or a few lunch pails gathered together, God can feed the hunger of thousands. And Jesus taught his disciples that day. They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Because generosity creates a way. That's how you make the road by walking, my friends. Remember that theme we're working on? By creating a way for someone else through your generosity. You give them something to eat. Don't hang around for a miracle. Help one happen instead. Handing over our little bits to God, the broken little bits, whatever we have, whether it's our food, our energy, our money, our willingness to help and to care, hand over the bits. It's a powerful idea and just crazy enough to work. The miracle begins when the disciples hand over all they had. From there, it grew and grew and grew. We don't know how. We don't. But we can wonder. And we can follow that example. And even in our disbelief that it will ever be enough, we can do as Jesus commanded and give them something to eat, knowing this to be true. That generosity creates a way. Amen.